Welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us today, you're probably looking to move beyond just surface level reading and truly understand the architecture of the information in front of you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, today we are taking a really specific stack of source material, foundational texts on biology. Specifically, we're focusing on Chapter 1, Reproduction in Organisms, and we're going to dissect it.
We really are. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we aren't just here to review vocabulary. Our mission today is to deconstruct the hidden logic of biology, to see exactly how these concepts are layered. Because seemingly simple paragraphs actually form the basis of incredibly complex scientific principles.
They do.
Joining me to navigate this material is our resident expert, someone who has spent over 15 years mentoring students and dissecting these exact texts for high-stakes environments.
Thank you. Looking over the outline and the source material we are covering today, I really think we have an incredible opportunity here. Yeah. In my 15 years of coaching, particularly preparing students for rigorous assessments like Neet, I've noticed a really distinct pattern.
Oh, I bet.
This specific topic, usually the very first chapter a student encounters in advanced biology, it serves as a critical filter.
A filter?
Exactly. It's the juncture where a learner either develops the capacity to think systemically about biological processes, or they just resign themselves to rote memorization.
Right, which is exactly what we want to avoid.
Precisely. Our goal today is firmly the former. We are going to build a framework for thinking, not just a list for remembering.
I love that. And, I found that distinction really apparent when I was reviewing the material. It's so easy to skim the first few pages and think, I know what reproduction is. I know what life and death are.
Right. Everyone thinks they know.
But when you actually read the specific phrasing used by the authors, you realize there is a massive amount of semantic precision.
So much precision.
We're looking at the fundamental mechanisms of how life persists, despite the absolute unavoidable certainty of death. The text frames it almost like this grand engineering problem that nature had to solve.
And that is exactly the framing we need to use. To truly grasp the biology, you have to first understand the problem biology is trying to solve.
Right.
If we start with the essence of the text, the core problem is extinction.
Extinction, okay.
Yeah. The source material establishes a foundational rule right at the beginning. Death is a certainty for almost every individual organism.
Except for one really weird exception we'll get to.
Exactly. We will explore that singular, fascinating exception to the rule a bit later. But for the vast majority of biological life, mortality is an inescapable physical boundary. Given that reality, the existence of vast numbers of plant and animal species over thousands of years presents a paradox.
Right, because if everything dies, how is anything still here?
Exactly. How does a continuous line exist when every single point on that line has a definitive end?
Okay, let's unpack this, because I had this massive aha moment here. The answer the text provides, of course, is reproduction. But to conceptualize it, I found myself thinking about it less like a factory producing identical widgets and more like a relay race.
A relay race. I like that.
Yeah, so if you consider an individual organism as a runner on a track, that runner is bound by physics and biology.
Right.
They possess a finite amount of metabolic energy, their cellular structures accumulate damage, and eventually, no matter how robust they are, they will have to stop.
Yes.
And that cessation is death. So the biological imperative, reproduction, it isn't a mechanism designed to give the first runner infinite energy.
Nature didn't solve the problem by making the runner invincible.
Exactly. Instead, nature invented the handoff. The baton is the genetic material. The goal is to pass that baton to a fresh runner, the offspring, before the first runner inevitably collapses.
What's fascinating here is that the relay race analogy is a very effective mental model. It highlights the continuity of the genetic information over the transience of the physical body.
Right, the body is just temporary.
The individual runner is merely a temporary vessel for the baton. However, if we look closer at that mechanism from a biological standpoint, we should note where the analogy requires a bit of nuance.
Okay.
In a standard track event, the baton is passed unchanged. In biology, as the text hints at and expands on later, the baton is often modified.
Oh, right, the genetic variation?
Yes, variation is introduced during the handoff. But strictly regarding the concept of continuity, your visualization works perfectly. It shifts the focus from the survival of the individual to the survival of the lineage.
Which brings us to how we define the parameters of that individual runner's time on the track. The source material provides a very specific definition. It states that the period from birth to the natural death of an organism represents its lifespan.
Yes.
It's a really concise sentence, but that word natural jumped out at me. It seems deliberate.
It is entirely deliberate, and
Yeah.
it is the fulcrum upon which many foundational misunderstandings pivot. Oh, absolutely. When examiners or textbooks emphasize natural death, they are drawing a strict line between internal biological programming and external environmental factors.
Yeah.
Let's explore the edge cases.
Okay.
If a deer is born in a forest, its internal physiology, its cellular repair mechanisms, its metabolic rate might theoretically sustain it for 15 years.
Right.
If a predator hunts it at age 3, its life has ended, but has not reached the end of its lifespan.
Because predation is an external interruption. It's an environmental hazard, not a biological conclusion.
Correct.
But what if we push that further? We all know predation or a forest fire interrupts the lifespan. What about a genetic disease? If an organism has a congenital defect that causes systemic failure at a young age, does the text classify that as a natural death?
That is an excellent analytical question from the perspective of the foundational text we are analyzing. Natural death refers to the process of senescence.
Senescence.
Yes, the gradual programmed deterioration of functional characteristics. A congenital defect is an anomaly in the programming, a deviation from the species' standard biological clock.
So it's a glitch.
Exactly. While the death is caused by internal factors, it doesn't represent the species' general lifespan. The lifespan is the typical functional duration of the biological machinery when it is allowed to run its course without premature disruption.
Whether that disruption is a predator's teeth or an anomalous genetic mutation.
Precisely.
So the lifespan is essentially the warranty period of the organism's hardware, assuming standard operating conditions.
That's a great way to put it. And understanding that definition is step one.
Right.
To build out our mental map of this entire topic, we need to organize the logical flow of the concepts. For you, the listener, you want to grab your mental highlighters here. How did you structure the progression of the material?
Well, I tried to avoid just reading the headers and instead looked at the narrative the text is building. I mapped it out into 4 distinct phases.
Let's hear them.
First, we have the individual, which establishes the baseline rules of lifespan and the certainty of death.
Right.
Second, we move to the loophole, the introduction of reproduction as the mechanism for continuity, the passing of the baton. Third, we transition to the influencers, examining what factors actually dictate the specific method an organism uses to reproduce. And finally, the text moves to the mechanisms, the detailed breakdown of asexual versus sexual reproduction.
Structuring the information logically like that, individual, loophole, influencers, mechanisms, is crucial. When you are synthesizing dense material, a framework prevents you from treating facts as isolated islands.
They become interconnected.
Interconnected nodes in a broader system.
Yes.
Let's dive into that first node, the individual, because the text addresses a very common cognitive bias regarding lifespans.
It does, and it's an area where human intuition completely fails us. When we look at the physical world, we intuitively associate mass and size with durability, like a towering skyscraper lasts longer than a wooden shack. A heavy iron vault withstands more degradation than a thin tin box.
It makes logical sense in physics.
Right, so it's very easy to apply that structural logic to biology and assume that larger organisms automatically possess longer lifespans. A massive elephant outlives a mouse. A giant redwood tree outlives a shrub. The pattern seems obvious.
It seems obvious, but biology does not strictly adhere to the rules of inanimate architecture.
No, it doesn't.
The structural integrity of biological matter is dynamic, not static. The text explicitly dispels the size-lifespan correlation myth, and the examples it uses are specifically chosen to highlight this disparity. It asks the reader to compare a crow and a parrot.
Right. If you analyze a crow and a parrot, their physical dimensions are remarkably similar. They occupy roughly the same volume, have similar masses, and their anatomical structures are comparable.
Very similar casings.
Exactly. Yet their lifespans are drastically different. A crow might live for 15 years, while certain parrots can live well over a century.
A massive difference.
And the text does the exact same thing with flora, comparing a mango tree to a peepal tree. 2 massive, woody, complex plants, yet the mango tree has a significantly shorter functional lifespan.
The contrast is jarring, and it begs the question, if physical bulk and structural size aren't keeping the parrot or the peepal tree alive longer, What is?
The text points us toward internal physiology, but I really want to unpack what that actually means in this context. Why exactly does a parrot outlive a crow when they seem so similar on the surface? We are essentially looking at the organism as a software program rather than just hardware.
That is a highly accurate way to conceptualize it. The physical size is just the casing. The lifespan is determined by the operating system running inside.
The software.
Right. When we talk about internal physiology dictating longevity, we are talking about microscopic cellular realities. We are talking about metabolic rates, how fast the organism burns energy, and consequently how much oxidative stress it puts on its own cells.
Wow. Okay.
We're talking about the efficiency of DNA repair enzymes. Every time a cell divides, there is a risk of genetic degradation, often tracked by the shortening of telomeres at the ends of chromosomes.
So a parrot just has better repair tools.
Exactly. An organism like a parrot has evolved an incredibly efficient internal mechanism for mitigating cellular damage, repairing DNA, and maintaining homeostasis over a long period. A crow's internal machinery operates on a different, faster timeline.
So the size of the casing is irrelevant if the internal cellular repair mechanisms are highly efficient. The hardware size doesn't dictate the software's efficiency.
Exactly. And examiners are acutely aware that students naturally default to the bigger is older architectural bias.
It's a trap.
It is a foundational misunderstanding driving many errors in competitive exams like Neet. A common trap is to present a question asking for the biological determinant of lifespan and offering physical size and mass as an option.
And if you don't know better, you pick it.
If you haven't internalized the crow, parrot, and mango people distinctions, your intuition will betray you. You must remember that lifespans are not necessarily correlated with sizes.
Moving along our structural map to the loophole, reproduction. The text defines a specific sequence for this mechanism. It outlines a cycle of birth, growth, and death, noting that offspring must grow and mature before they, in turn, produce new offspring.
Yes.
I find the inclusion of the maturation phase really interesting. From an efficiency standpoint, one might ask why organisms don't just reproduce immediately upon birth to maximize the population growth rate.
If we visualize it from an engineering or resource management perspective, immediate reproduction is impossible for complex life because of the immense energetic demands of the process.
It requires infrastructure.
Precisely. When an organism is born, it is essentially a biological startup.
A startup, I like that.
It has the foundational code, but it lacks the capital.
Hmm.
In this case, biomass and stored energy. The maturation phase is the period where the organism acts as a resource sink.
It's just consuming.
Right. It consumes nutrients from its environment, builds bone, muscle, specialized tissues, and develops its reproductive organs. Passing the baton requires a massive expenditure of metabolic currency.
So if it tried to pass the baton right away...
If an organism attempted to reproduce before acquiring the necessary biological infrastructure, the energetic cost would kill the parent, and the offspring would likely not be viable. The text is very deliberate in establishing that chronological order. Birth, growth, reproduction, death. Maturation is not just a waiting period. It is an active phase of biological resource accumulation.
That makes perfect sense. You can't spend metabolic currency you haven't earned.
Yeah.
So once the organism has matured and built that infrastructure, it has to reproduce. But how does it decide which mechanism to use? This brings us to the influencer section of our map. The text states that the mechanism of reproduction depends collectively on 3 factors: the organism's habitat, its internal physiology, and several other factors.
This is what I refer to as the reproduction trifecta, and it is a high-yield concept that frequently trips up students. It is a prime example of where incomplete understanding leads to testing errors. Let's break down those pillars.
Okay. The first pillar is habitat, which feels very intuitive. The environmental pressures of a deep-sea thermal vent are vastly different from those of an arid desert.
Completely different.
The environment naturally selects for reproductive strategies that optimize survival in those specific conditions. Like amphibians need water for their eggs, reptiles have evolved hard-shelled eggs to reproduce on dry land.
The habitat is the external constraint. Students rarely forget that pillar. The trap lies in the second pillar, internal physiology.
Why is that a trap?
Often, a learner will assume the environment is the sole dictator of the reproductive strategy. They see an organism in the water and assume the water dictates everything. But the internal biological makeup, the cellular complexity, the presence or absence of a nucleus, the tissue organization, it's an equal, if not more powerful, determinant.
How does internal physiology force a reproductive strategy?
Consider a simple bacterial cell compared to a complex multicellular organism like a fish. both living in the exact same aquatic habitat.
Okay.
Same environment. The habitat is identical, but their internal physiologies are worlds apart. The bacteria lacks organized tissues, complex organs, and specialized germ cells. Its internal physiology essentially limits its reproductive options to simple division, splitting in two.
Right.
The fish, possessing a highly complex internal physiology with specialized reproductive organs, a nervous system, and endocrine signaling, has the internal infrastructure to produce specialized gametes and engage in complex mating behaviors. The internal complexity dictates the reproductive ceiling.
So an examiner might present a scenario asking why two organisms in the same environment reproduce differently, and the trap is to look for microscopic differences in their habitat, when the real answer is their internal physiological capabilities.
Exactly. The internal software determines the available operational modes. If you don't explicitly remember internal physiology alongside habitat, you're only seeing half the biological picture.
And of course, the text includes several other factors, which serves as a catch-all for evolutionary history, genetic mutations, and specific ecological niches.
Right. But habitat and internal physiology are the twin pillars you must anchor in your memory.
Anchoring those concepts is critical because they set the stage for the actual mechanisms, asexual versus sexual reproduction. And this is where I noticed a significant semantic nuance in the text that fundamentally alters how we define these terms. It's a definition that contradicts how these concepts are often simplified in earlier educational stages.
You are referring to the involvement of gametes.
Yes. The conventional simplified teaching is often a strict binary. Sexual reproduction equals gametes, and asexual reproduction equals no gametes.
Yes.
But the advanced text we are analyzing defines asexual reproduction very specifically. It states that when offspring is produced by a single parent, with or without the involvement of gamete formation, the reproduction is asexual. That phrase, with or without, is a massive paradigm shift.
It is arguably the most critical distinction in the entire chapter, and it is the origin of countless mistakes.
I can see why.
What's fascinating here is the fundamental defining characteristic of asexual reproduction is not the absence of gametes. The absolute non-negotiable requirement is the single parent. It is uniparental.
So how does a single parent involve gametes without it becoming sexual reproduction?
To understand this, we need to clarify what sexual reproduction actually is. Sexual reproduction requires two things: two parents, typically of opposite sexes, and the fusion of male and female gametes to form a zygote. The fusion, the mixing of genetic material, is the hallmark of sexual reproduction.
So in asexual reproduction, even if gametes are formed, they aren't fusing with another organism's gametes.
Precisely. There are biological scenarios where an organism produces a gamete, say an egg cell, and that egg cell develops into a fully formed, viable offspring without ever being fertilized by sperm. This process is called parthenogenesis.
Parthenogenesis. I've heard the term, but let's demystify it so it doesn't just sound like an academic jargon. How does that practically work in nature?
Think of certain species of whiptail lizards, or even more commonly, honeybees.
Honeybees, okay.
In a honeybee hive, the queen bee produces eggs. If she allows an egg to be fertilized by sperm, she is stored from a male drone. That fertilized egg, a fusion of two gametes, develops into a female worker bee.
Because it's a fusion, that's sexual reproduction.
That is sexual reproduction. However, if the queen lays an unfertilized egg, that single gamete develops entirely on its own into a male drone bee.
Wow. So the drone bee is the product of a single gamete from a single parent with no fusion involved.
Correct. The queen produced a gamete, but because there was no fusion with a second parent, the resulting offspring is a product of asexual reproduction. Therefore, the definition must account for this reality. Asexual reproduction is a single parent, with or without the formation of gametes.
If you mentally lock in the no gametes rule, processes like parthenogenesis will cause you to completely misinterpret biological questions.
Absolutely. You will fall right into the examiner's trap.
That is a fascinating evolutionary strategy. It allows an organism to rapidly populate an environment without the energetic cost of finding a mate, while still utilizing the specialized reproductive cellular machinery it possesses. It really highlights why reading the text with extreme precision is necessary. The textbook authors aren't just adding words for length. Every clause is defending a biological reality.
And this attention to precise language leads to another subtle but profound point in the text, which acts as foreshadowing for later, more complex chapters. When the text introduces reproduction, it notes that genetic variation is created and inherited during this process, specifically referring the reader to principles of inheritance and variation that will be studied later.
Why does the introductory chapter feel the need to point forward like that? Why not just stick to the basic definitions and save the complexity for later?
Because in biology, form and function are inseparable from evolution. Examiners and textbook authors want to ensure students don't view reproduction as merely a biological photocopy machine.
Right.
If you only focus on the creation of a new organism, you miss the larger systemic purpose. The fusion of gametes we just discussed in sexual reproduction isn't just a complicated way to make a baby. It is the biological engine of genetic variation. It takes half a genetic code from parent A, half from parent B, and creates a novel combination.
It shuffles the deck.
Exactly. And that shuffled deck, that variation, is the raw material upon which natural selection acts. Without variation, an entire species is vulnerable to a single threat. If a new virus emerges, and every individual is a perfect clone, the entire species could be wiped out instantly.
Because they all have the exact same weakness.
Yes. Variation ensures that some individuals might possess a slight genetic resistance, allowing the species to survive. By foreshadowing the principles of inheritance, the text is urging the learner to view reproduction not just as a mechanism for continuity, but as the foundational driver of evolutionary adaptation. You have to link Chapter 1 to Chapter 5 in your mind to see the complete picture.
That interconnectedness is what makes the subject so compelling once you get past the surface definitions. And speaking of compelling, I want to pivot to a part of the text that genuinely made me pause and rethink my understanding of life itself.
This is the best part.
We established early on and very firmly that death is a 100% certainty for the individual. The runner always collapses. But nestled right in the middle of these rules is a profound exception.
The immortal single cells.
Yes. The text states, no individual is immortal except single-celled organisms. And it immediately challenges the reader with a question. Why do we say there is no natural death in single-celled organisms?
It is a stunning biological reality. We define the parameters of life by its inevitable conclusion. To find a biological entity that exists outside that boundary challenges our fundamental definitions of existence.
Let's break down the cellular mechanics of why this is true, because it relies on how we define natural death physically.
Okay.
When a multicellular organism dies, whether it's the parrot, the mango tree, or a human, the biological machinery ceases and the physical matter remains. We leave behind a corpse. The physical matter that comprised the individual entity begins to decay. The boundary of the individual is permanently closed.
The creation of a corpse is the definitive marker of a natural death in multicellular life. The somatic cells, the cells making up the body, die. Only a microscopic fraction of the organism's material, the germ cells or gametes, has the potential to continue.
But when we observe a single-celled organism like an amoeba or a bacterium reproducing, the process is fundamentally different. An amoeba doesn't construct a smaller, separate baby amoeba inside itself, give birth to it, and then eventually age and die.
No, it doesn't.
The reproduction process is mitosis, or binary fission. When the amoeba reaches a critical mass and point in its biological cycle, it duplicates its genetic material and then literally physically divides itself in half.
The single-parent cell reorganizes its entire physical mass and splits into two new daughters or offspring cells.
Meaning the parent cell has completely ceased to exist as a singular entity, but, and this is the mind-bending part, it hasn't died.
There's no corpse.
Exactly. There is no corpse, there's no physical matter left behind to decay. The entirety of the parent's physical substance continues to exist. It has merely been redistributed into two new vessels. The runner didn't drop the baton and collapse. The runner magically split into two new runners who kept on running.
From a purely physical and biological standpoint, natural death has not occurred because the biomass never ceased to function. The metabolic processes didn't stop. They just divided their physical location.
But let me push back on that, or at least explore the edge of that definition. Does the parent really survive? If we look at the DNA, every time a cell divides, there is a chance for mutation. Over thousands of generations of an amoeba dividing, the genetic code of the current cell might be noticeably different from the original ancestor cell. If the genetic identity drifts, has the original organism essentially faded away, even if there was no physical death?
That ventures into a brilliant philosophical intersection with biology, the paradox of the ship of Theseus. If you replace every wooden plank on a ship over time, is it still the same ship? Biologically, the lineage is immortal. The physical matter is continuous, but identity, in terms of exact genetic sequence, is fluid. However, the textbook definition relies on the physical cessation of metabolic function. Because the protoplasm and the cellular machinery never stop operating and simply distribute themselves, there is no discrete event of death. The individual sacrifices its singular identity for absolute physical continuity.
It trades individuality for biological immortality. It's a perfectly efficient system with zero biological waste.
And it highlights a massive evolutionary divergence. Single-celled life opted for immortality through division. Multicellular life opted for complexity, but the required price for that complexity was the invention of the corpse. We traded immortality for the ability to build specialized tissue, organs, and nervous systems.
That is an incredible way to frame it. The invention of the corpse was the prerequisite for complexity. This deep semantic precision we are uncovering brings me to another moment in the text that seems small but carries massive weight. It's in the basic definition of reproduction itself. The text defines it as a biological process in which an organism gives rise to young ones, or offspring, similar to itself.
The inclusion of the word similar is the linchpin of evolutionary biology.
Because it explicitly does not say identical. When I first read it, my brain almost auto-corrected similar to identical. You assume reproduction is about making a perfect copy. A dog makes a dog, a fern makes a fern. But the author specifically chose a word that implies a degree of variance.
If the text defined reproduction as producing offspring identical to the parent, it would be describing a static, unchangeable biological world. It would describe a mechanism of pure cloning. As we discussed earlier regarding the foreshadowing of inheritance and variation, a world of pure clones is biologically fragile.
A single environmental shift or a novel pathogen could trigger mass extinction because every organism would share the exact same vulnerabilities.
Exactly. By using the word similar, the text establishes the boundaries of continuity while mandating the existence of variation. Similar means the offspring maintains the fundamental characteristics of the species. A cat gives birth to a feline, not a canine. That is the continuity of inheritance. But similar also means the offspring might have a slightly different coat pattern, a marginally faster metabolic rate, or a slightly different immune response.
That is the variation.
Right. Even in the most rudimentary introductory definition, the text makes room for Darwinian evolution.
It's a testament to the fact that in advanced science texts, there are no throwaway words. Every adjective and verb is carrying structural weight.
They really are.
We have deconstructed a massive amount of conceptual architecture today. We've analyzed the definitions of lifespan and natural death, dismantled the intuitive biases regarding size and longevity, explored the energetic realities of maturation, and dissected the deep semantic nuances of asexual reproduction and cellular immortality.
We have covered a lot of ground.
To ensure this framework actually holds, we need to solidify it. For you listening, we need to create memory anchors.
This is the crucial final step of active learning: synthesis and anchoring. For anyone listening, particularly those preparing to apply these concepts in high-pressure environments, the broad understanding must now be condensed into sharp, retrievable facts. Here is what you must remember from this analysis. These are the 5 non-negotiable pillars of this topic.
Let's lay them out. Anchor number 1.
Anchor number 1, the definition of lifespan. You must remember that it is the period from birth to natural death. Do not let examiners trick you with scenarios of predation, accidents, or environmental hazards. The lifespan is determined by the organism's internal biological clock and the process of natural senescence.
Got it. Anchor number 2.
Anchor number 2, the size myth. This is the primary trap. You must remember that an organism's physical size does not correlate with its lifespan. Physical bulk does not equate to biological longevity. The highly testable textual examples you must have ready are the crow versus the parrot, and the mango tree versus the peepal tree. When you see those pairs, recognize the concept being tested.
Anchor number 3.
Anchor number 3, the immortals. Single-celled organisms are the biological exception to the certainty of death. Because they reproduce through division, the parent cell physically becomes the offspring. There is no cessation of metabolic function and no physical corpse left behind. Therefore, they experience no natural death.
Anchor number 4.
Anchor number 4, the reproduction trifecta. When determining what dictates an organism's reproductive strategy, you must recall the 3 collective factors: habitat, internal physiology, and several other factors. The common error is forgetting the role of internal physiology. The internal complexity of the organism is just as vital as its external environment in determining how it reproduces.
And finally, anchor number 5.
Anchor number 5, the asexual trap. This is the definition you must recalibrate. Asexual reproduction is defined strictly by the involvement of a single parent, with or without the involvement of gamete formation. Erase the simplistic no gametes rule from your mind. Understand that processes like parthenogenesis exist, where a single parent produces a gamete that develops without fusion. By contrast, sexual reproduction mandates two parents and the fusion of male and female gametes.
Those 5 anchors form a robust defense against almost any conceptual question derived from this material. If you understand the mechanics behind those 5 points, you aren't just memorizing, you are predicting how the examiner will test the material.
That's the ultimate goal.
To lock this in completely, I want to attempt a rapid-fire sticky summary. This is the 60-second synthesis of the entire chapter's core logic.
I am ready. Let's hear the synthesis.
Death is an absolute physical boundary for all life, except for single-celled organisms, which achieve immortality by physically dividing into their own offspring and leaving no corpse behind. To combat the certainty of extinction, life relies on reproduction, a necessary chronological cycle of birth, growth to acquire energetic resources, and reproduction before inevitable death. Human intuition fails us regarding longevity. A massive size does not guarantee a long life, as internal physiology, not physical bulk, dictates the lifespan, proven by the contrasting lifespans of crows and parrots. How an organism executes reproduction depends entirely on its external habitat and its internal physiological complexity. If an organism reproduces alone, even if it utilizes unfertilized gametes, it is asexual. If it requires two parents and the fusion of gametes, introducing the genetic variation necessary for evolution, it is sexual.
That is an exceptionally tight synthesis. It captures the rules, the exceptions, the biological rationale, and the semantic nuances. If a learner can articulate that summary, they possess a functional mastery of the topic's foundation.
And beyond the utility of passing an exam, diving into the material, this deeply fundamentally alters how you perceive the biological world. It shifts biology from a static list of animals and plants into a dynamic, ongoing saga of problem solving. Every bird you see, every tree, every insect is a temporary vessel, a runner executing a complex strategy to pass an ancient genetic baton against the ticking clock of natural senescence.
It really is beautiful when you look at it that way.
As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to explore on your own. It builds on the profound evolutionary divergence we discussed regarding single-celled immortality.
Oh, it's a good one.
We established that single-celled organisms possess a form of biological immortality by dividing themselves entirely, avoiding the creation of a corpse. But evolution clearly didn't stop there. Life forms grouped together, specialized, and became multicellular. Consider the exact evolutionary moment when life made that transition. At what precise point did a colony of immortal single cells become a singular multicellular organism? And more importantly, how did the internal programming decide that some cells, the somatic cells making up the new body, would now be programmed to age, die, and become a corpse, while only a tiny fraction, the germ cells, would retain the privilege of continuity?
It's staggering to think about.
When did life accept the absolute certainty of death as the necessary price for building a brain, a wing, or a leaf?
It is the ultimate question of biological trade-offs. Exploring how that division of labor arose is exploring the very origins of complex existence.
It is a question that requires looking at biology not as a static science, but as a historical record of survival. Thank you for guiding us through this conceptual architecture today.
It was my pleasure. The true joy of this subject is found in the depth.
For everyone listening, keep pushing past the surface definitions. Keep searching for the internal mechanisms, the semantic precision, and the hidden logic in the texts you read. We will catch you on the next deep dive.